Northern Chile is defined by absence. The Atacama Desert receives almost no rainfall. In some areas, decades pass without measurable precipitation. The ground is compacted dust and mineral. Vegetation appears only in isolated pockets. The air is dry, thin, and still. The San Jose mine sits outside the city of Copiapó, several hundred miles north of Santiago. From the surface, it is unremarkable. A cluster of industrial structures rests against low hills stained with iron and copper. Roads leading to the site are narrow and pale, cut through open land with little traffic. The horizon is wide and uninterrupted. Mining has shaped this region for centuries. The desert holds copper, gold, and other metals embedded deep in rock. Extraction here is routine, governed by schedules rather than seasons. Work continues regardless of weather because the climate rarely changes. Above ground, sound carries easily. Machinery hums, trucks arrive and leave, shifts begin and end according to the clock. There is little sense of depth from the surface. The mine's presence is suggested more by infrastructure than by any visible opening into the earth. Beneath this terrain, tunnels extend downward and outward, branching through layers of rock formed millions of years earlier. Temperatures rise with depth. Light disappears quickly. Orientation depends entirely on artificial systems, rails, cables, markers, and memory. On most days, the separation between surface and underground feels controlled. The descent is planned. The return is expected. The mine functions as a closed environment that opens and closes on schedule. On the morning of August 5, 2010, the desert above the San Jose mine remained unchanged. The air was clear. The ground was stable. There were no outward signs of disruption. Work proceeded as it had the day before. The San Jose mine had been operating intermittently since the late 19th century. By 2010, it was an aging gold and copper mine with a mixed safety record. Production levels fluctuated with market conditions. Ownership had changed hands multiple times. Maintenance was ongoing but uneven, shaped by financial pressure and the physical difficulty of stabilizing deep tunnels in fractured rock. The mine descended to depths of more than 700 meters. Access was provided by a spiral ramp wide enough for vehicles, along with vertical shafts used for ventilation and emergency escape. At that depth, temperatures regularly exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Airflow depended on mechanical systems. Natural light did not penetrate beyond the first sections of tunnel. The workforce was composed of experienced miners, many from the surrounding region. Some had spent decades underground. Others had moved between mines as contracts shifted. Mining in northern Chile was a primary source of employment, particularly for those without access to higher education. Skills were learned on the job and passed informally between workers. On August 5th, 33 men were working in the mine. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 50s. Roles varied. Some operated heavy machinery. Others handled blasting, transport, or maintenance. A shift underground could last up to 12 hours, depending on assignments and conditions. Many of the miners had worked at San Jose before. They were familiar with its layout and its limitations. Rockfalls had occurred in the past. In 2007, a worker had died in an accident at the site. Inspections had led to temporary closures, followed by reopening after corrective measures were reported. Risk was acknowledged but normalized. The decision to work underground that day followed established routine. Tasks were assigned. Equipment was checked. The descent began in stages as crews moved to their designated levels. Communication with the surface was maintained through radios and scheduled reports. The mine's emergency provisions were minimal. A refuge chamber existed at level 700, intended as a temporary shelter in case of accident. It was stocked with limited food, water, and oxygen tanks designed to sustain a small group for short periods. It was not intended for long-term occupancy. Emergency escape routes were present, but vulnerable. The main ramp was the primary exit. Secondary shafts offered alternatives, but depended on structural integrity and access. Redundancy existed on paper, but in practice, many systems shared the same geological risks. The miners did not enter the mine with the expectation of danger. Their experience shaped caution, but not alarm. Work underground always carried risk, but collapse was not considered imminent. There were no warnings that morning suggesting a significant structural failure. By mid-morning, the men were dispersed across working areas near the bottom of the mine. Machinery was in operation. Drilling and transport continued. The routines of extraction proceeded in an environment shaped by repetition and constraint. What occurred next did not originate from a single action or decision.
It emerged from the accumulated instability of the mine itself.
At approximately 2 p.m. local time, the mine failed. A massive rock collapse occurred near the main access ramp, several hundred meters above level 700. An estimated 700,000 metric tons of rock fell in a confined section of tunnel, filling the passage and destroying infrastructure as it descended. The collapse generated dust and shock waves that traveled through the mine's lower levels. For the miners working near the bottom, the event was immediately apparent. Air pressure shifted, visibility dropped, communication systems went silent. The sound was sustained and unfamiliar, distinct from smaller, routine rockfalls. Initial responses followed training. Work stopped. The men moved away from active phases and attempted to regroup. Radios were used, but contact with the surface could not be established. The main ramp, the primary route out, was no longer passable. Attempts were made to reach secondary escape shafts. These routes were found to be blocked or inaccessible due to debris and structural damage. The collapse had severed multiple pathways at once. The mine's depth and design offered no alternative route that remained open. As dust settled, the scale of the isolation became clearer. The collapse was not localized. It extended across a broad section of the mine, cutting off all known exits. The air remained breathable, but ventilation was reduced. The miners gathered and assessed their situation using the information available. They accounted for all personnel. No one had been killed in the initial collapse. Injuries were minor, consisting mainly of cuts and bruises. With no exit available and no communication with the surface, the group moved toward the refuge chamber at level 700. It was the only space designed for containment and supply. The chamber was reached without further incident. Once inside, the miners inventoried what the refuge contained. The provisions were limited and outdated. Food consisted of canned goods and crackers intended for short-term use. Water supplies were minimal. There was no independent communication system. At this point, isolation became unavoidable. The collapse could not be cleared from below. The men were sealed inside the mine, dependent on external rescue efforts they could not observe or influence. The transition from workday to confinement occurred without warning. The mine did not offer a gradual failure. It closed. The refuge chamber at level 700 was not built for permanence. It was a reinforced room carved into rock, designed to hold a small number of people for a short duration while rescue routes were cleared. It contained limited food, water, and oxygen tanks. Lighting was minimal. Ventilation depended on the mine's systems, which were now compromised. 33 men occupied the space. The first task was accounting. Names were checked. Injuries were assessed. No one required immediate medical intervention beyond basic care. The absence of fatalities in the collapse itself was noted without emphasis. Attention shifted to what could be controlled. Food supplies were inventoried. The chamber held a small quantity of tuna, crackers, and milk. The total was insufficient for more than a few days if consumed normally. Water was similarly limited. Rationing began immediately. A decision was made to centralize authority. Luis Urzua, the shift supervisor and one of the most experienced miners present, assumed coordination of daily activity. The choice was practical rather than formal. Clear roles reduced friction and uncertainty. Rations were reduced to minimal portions. Each man received a small amount of food every 48 hours. Water intake was restricted. The aim was to extend supplies as long as possible without causing immediate collapse of health. Hunger became constant. Thirst followed. The ambient wine environment imposed additional constraints. Temperatures at that depth exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity increased as ventilation decreased. Physical exertion was minimized to conserve energy and reduce heat stress. Movement was limited to essential tasks. Light was rationed. Headlamps and fixed lighting were used sparingly. Darkness became the default state. When lights were on, they were shared. Visual cues were reduced to what was necessary for safety. The men organized themselves into groups. Some were responsible for ration distribution. Others maintained sanitation. Waste management was addressed using improvised methods, separating living areas from designated disposal zones. Cleanliness was enforced to reduce illness. Mental discipline became part of routine. Time was divided into shifts, despite the absence of natural day-night cycles. Sleep periods were assigned. Activity blocks were defined. This structure provided reference points in an environment where time otherwise blurred.
The refuge chamber at level 700 did not contain sufficient oxygen for long-term occupancy. Airflow from the mine's ventilation shafts continued intermittently, though reduced. The miners monitored air quality informally, noting changes in temperature, smell, and breathing effort. Oxygen tanks were conserved as a last resort. Communication with the surface did not exist during this phase. The miners could not signal. They could not hear drilling or movement above. The mine was silent beyond their immediate surroundings. After the initial days, food supplies in the refuge were exhausted. Survival then depended on resources elsewhere in the mine. The men organized expeditions to retrieve additional materials from work areas that were still accessible. These trips were planned carefully, with attention to stability and distance. They recovered small quantities of food left in vehicles and equipment caches. Lunch containers, energy drinks, and personal supplies were collected and redistributed. Nothing was consumed privately. All items were inventoried and redistributed according to the rationing plan. Water was sourced from industrial lines within the mine. Though not intended for drinking, it was filtered and treated as best as possible. Consumption remained limited. Dehydration was a constant concern. Health monitoring was informal but continuous. Those showing signs of weakness were given slightly adjusted rations when possible. The goal was group survival rather than individual optimization. No one was excluded. Psychological stress was managed through routine and containment. Discussions of worst outcomes were discouraged. Focus remained on tasks. The men avoided speculation about rescue timelines. There was no information to support such estimates. Conflicts occurred but were addressed quickly. Space was limited. Privacy did not exist. Irritation was inevitable.
Leadership intervened to maintain cohesion. Decisions were explained. Rules were enforced consistently. As days passed, physical changes became visible. Weight loss was universal. Energy levels declined. Heat tolerance decreased. Sleep became fragmented. Despite this, basic order remained. After more than 2 weeks underground, sounds from above were finally heard. Drilling vibrations traveled faintly through rock. The source was uncertain. It could have been rescue efforts or unrelated activity. The men could not confirm. They responded by making noise from below, striking metal against rock at scheduled intervals. The sound carried unpredictably. There was no confirmation of reception. On August 22, 17 days after the collapse, a drill broke through into the mine near the refuge. A small borehole opened. Through it, the miners made contact with the surface for the first time. A note was attached to the drill bit and sent upward. It read, "Estamos bien en el refugio, los 33. We are well in the refuge, the 33. Contact changed the nature of survival. Isolation ended, but confinement remained. From this point forward, survival became coordinated with external systems. Supplies were lowered through the borehole. Food, water, medicine, and communication equipment arrived in stages. Rations improved incrementally. Medical assessments were conducted remotely. Communication allowed structure to be reinforced. Schedules were adjusted to align with surface teams. Lighting cycles were imposed to simulate day and night. Psychological support was provided through messages and audio contact. Despite improved conditions, the environment remained harsh. Heat persisted. Space did not increase. Extraction was not immediate. Engineers determined that drilling a rescue shaft large enough to remove the men would take weeks. During this period, discipline remained essential. Increased supplies did not eliminate the need for rationing. Physical activity was managed to preserve strength for extraction. Medical monitoring identified issues, including infections, dental problems, and vision changes. Treatment was limited by what could be delivered through the narrow shaft. Care focused on stabilization. The men were informed of the rescue plans in general terms. Specific timelines were avoided. Drilling progressed slowly through unstable rock. Setbacks occurred above ground, unseen by those below. Life at level 700 became a balance between improved support and prolonged waiting. Survival was no longer solely internal, but it was not yet resolved. The systems that had sustained the group in isolation continued to function, now integrated with external assistance. The environment remained unchanged. The rock did not move. The wait extended.
As September progressed, the miners' situation stabilized materially, but remained fragile physically and psychologically. Food deliveries became regular, but intake was carefully controlled by medical teams on the surface. Sudden increases in calories were avoided to prevent metabolic shock. Hunger eased, but weakness persisted. The environment at level 700 did not improve. Temperatures remained high. Humidity increased as more people moved and breathed in confined space. Ventilation was managed through improvised systems, but airflow was uneven. Sleep continued to be shallow and interrupted. Extended confinement produced cumulative strain. Minor health issues became persistent problems. Skin infections developed where heat and moisture combined. Dental pain emerged in some miners, difficult to treat remotely. Vision blurred for several men after prolonged darkness, even with artificial lighting cycles imposed. Psychological pressure increased as time passed without extraction. Initial relief at making contact with the surface gave way to impatience and uncertainty. Drilling plans changed repeatedly as boreholes encountered unstable rock. Information shared with the miners was limited and carefully moderated. Tension surfaced in subtle ways. Irritability increased. Concentration declined. Small disagreements required intervention. Leadership remained central. Schedules were reinforced. Group meetings were held to distribute information evenly and prevent rumor. The awareness of risk returned in a new form. Rescue efforts above ground involved drilling large shafts through fractured rock. The miners understood that collapse during extraction was possible. This knowledge was acknowledged but not emphasized. Focus remained on preparation. Physical conditioning became part of routine. Simple exercises were introduced to preserve muscle tone and cardiovascular function. Space constraints limited movement. Activities were adapted to standing or seated positions. Participation varied based on individual condition. Time perception altered further. Days were counted, but anticipation distorted their weight. Each update from the surface carried potential change. When delays were announced, disappointment was contained rather than expressed. Media attention on the surface expanded rapidly, though it was largely filtered from those underground. The miners were aware of increased activity above, but experienced none of its visibility. Their environment remained constant and enclosed. Health monitoring identified cases of anxiety and depression. Psychological support was provided through scheduled conversations. The goal was stability, not resolution. No one was removed from the group. Cohesion remained intact. As extraction neared, medical teams prepared for reintegration risks. Extended confinement posed dangers during ascent, including cardiovascular stress and disorientation. Protocols were developed to manage transition gradually. By early October, the drilling of the primary rescue shaft was complete. Final preparations began. The miners were informed that extraction would occur soon, though exact timing remained uncertain. At this stage, survival was assured in principle, but not yet in outcome. The final risk lay in the transition itself. The darkness remained until the opening was made. On October 12, 2010, the final phase of the rescue began. A steel capsule, designed specifically for the conditions of the San Jose mine, was lowered into the newly drilled rescue shaft. The shaft measured approximately 622 meters from the surface to level 700. Its diameter was just wide enough for the capsule to pass with minimal clearance. Extraction proceeded one miner at a time. Each man was fitted with protective gear and a harness. Medical checks were conducted before ascent. Instructions were brief and procedural. Movement inside the capsule was restricted. The ascent was slow and controlled, monitored continuously from the surface. The first miner reached the surface shortly before midnight local time. Subsequent extractions followed at regular intervals. The process continued through the night and into the following day. Conditions underground remained stable during extraction. The miners waited in sequence. Order was maintained. No changes were made to the established routine beyond preparation for ascent. Those remaining below continued to conserve energy. As each miner was raised, medical teams conducted immediate evaluations. Dehydration,
weight loss, and muscular atrophy were present in all cases. Psychological effects varied. Treatment focused on stabilization rather than recovery. The final miner reached the surface on October 13, 69 days after the collapse. There were no injuries during extraction. The rescue equipment functioned as designed. The mine remained structurally intact throughout the operation. For the men who had been underground, the transition from darkness to daylight was managed gradually. Vision was protected. Noise and activity were controlled. The process emphasized continuity rather than conclusion. The rescue ended without incident. Below ground, the refuge chamber was left as it was. Lights were turned off. The space returned to silence. The mine did not reopen. The survival of the 33 miners did not erase the conditions that led to the collapse. Investigations that followed identified structural instability, inadequate safety measures, and regulatory failures at the San Jose mine. Legal and financial consequences unfolded over years, with limited resolution for those affected. For the miners, recovery extended beyond physical health. Prolonged confinement left lasting effects, including chronic pain, sleep disruption, and psychological stress. Reintegration into ordinary life occurred unevenly. Some returned to mining. Others did not. The event altered international attention on mine safety and emergency response. New protocols were studied. Rescue technologies were refined. The incident became a reference point rather than an anomaly. What endured most clearly was the record of sustained coordination under constraint. Survival depended less on individual endurance than on collective discipline, structured routine, and external support applied with restraint. The mine remains sealed. The desert above it continues unchanged. Wind moves across the surface without reference to what occurred below. The period underground ended when the shaft opened. The darkness did not resist. It simply remained where it had always been.